I let the police arrest my own mother-in-law after she smashed my entire coffee shop display in front of 50 customers, screaming that I was nothing without her daughter. The crash sounded like a car accident happening inside my own shop. I was in the back office, elbow deep in a stack of invoices, when I heard it. Ceramic exploding against tile, 50 conversations stopping at once, then a scream that cut through all of it, high and furious, a voice I'd know anywhere. I came out from behind the espresso machine and the whole shop had gone still. 50 conversations, cut off mid-sentence, customers frozen mid-sip, mugs halfway to their mouths, a barista's steam wand still hissing uselessly into an abandoned pitcher of milk. My newest hire, Lily Chen, 19 years old, was backed against the pastry case with both hands pressed over her mouth, her name tag crooked, like she'd grabbed at it without meaning to. Shards of glazed ceramic covered the floor in a wide fan pattern, catching the morning light through the front windows and throwing small, bright reflections across the ceiling. One of the mugs had caught a woman's shin on its way down. She sat frozen in her chair, staring at the blood soaking into her leggings like she couldn't quite process what had happened to her own leg. And in the middle of all of it stood Diane, my mother-in-law, 61 years old, dressed like she was attending a luncheon instead of destroying a business, chest heaving. 3 of her book club friends clustered near the door, already backing toward it. What happened? I said. Calm. I'd learned calm was the only thing that worked with Diane. This incompetent little girl, Diane said, jabbing a finger at Lily, told me to wait in line like a common customer. Lily's voice shook. I just asked her to go to the back of the line. That's it. That's all I said. I looked at the wreckage on the floor. 6 broken mugs. Our entire hand-thrown display. The one I'd special ordered from a potter in Athens, Ohio, 3 months earlier. $2,400, gone in one sweep of an arm. Diane, I said, did you do this? You ungrateful little nothing, she screamed, loud enough that people 2 doors down probably heard her. You'd be nothing without my daughter. Nothing. You hear me? I didn't answer her. I pulled my phone out of my apron pocket and dialed 911. Her face changed the instant she heard me say the word dispatch. The fury drained out and something colder slid in behind it. She backed toward a chair, one hand pressed to her chest, and started gasping like she was having a heart attack in front of 50 witnesses who, 10 seconds earlier, had watched her do this with both hands and a clear head. I didn't move to help her. I stood there holding a broom, and I waited. That was the moment everything after this story started from. Not the mugs, not the scream. The moment I realized I wasn't going to protect her anymore, no matter what it cost me at Thanksgiving. To understand how we got here, you have to go back 6 years, to the first time I ever sat across a table from Diane Whitfield and watched her send back a glass of water because the ice cubes weren't uniform in size. I was 29 then. I'd been dating Addison for 8 months, and she'd finally worked up the nerve to bring me to a family dinner at her parents' house in Bexley, the kind of Columbus neighborhood with brick sidewalks and mature oak trees and property taxes that made my stomach hurt. Addison had warned me in the car. My mom is a lot, she'd said. Just don't take it personally. She's not always like this. She was always like that. I just didn't know it yet. Diane greeted me at the door with a smile that didn't move past her mouth. She looked me up and down once, the way you'd assess a used car, and said, so you're the coffee boy. At the time, I was managing a shop for someone else, saving every spare dollar toward the idea of my own place. Addison had told her mother that. Diane had chosen to hear coffee boy instead of the person building a business. Dinner went the way I'd learned all Whitfield family dinners went. Diane sent the water back twice. She interrogated the waiter about a coupon that had expired the previous spring, insisting the restaurant honor it anyway, and when the manager politely declined, she asked to speak to someone above him. There was no one above him. She asked anyway. Addison's father, Gerald, a retired civil engineer with the permanently tired eyes of a man who'd been married to Diane for 36 years, said almost nothing the entire meal. He passed the bread. He nodded at appropriate intervals. I understood, watching him, that I was looking at my own future if I wasn't careful. Addison caught my eye twice that night, mouthing, I'm sorry, across the table. I didn't mind, not really. I thought Diane was simply particular, high maintenance, the kind of woman who'd mellow with time once she trusted me, once she saw I made her daughter happy. I was wrong about almost all of that, but I didn't find out how wrong for a while. It took me longer still to understand what it had been like to grow up as Diane's daughter, rather than simply date into her orbit as an adult. Addison told me, months into our relationship, about a childhood spent constantly managing her mother's moods, learning early which subjects were safe and which ones would trigger a cold shoulder that could last for days. She'd been a competitive swimmer in high school, good enough to draw some college interest, until Diane decided the early practice schedule was an insult to family time and pressured her into quitting during her junior year. Addison had internalized, long before I ever met her, that love from her mother came with conditions attached, invoices she wouldn't see the full total of until years later. Understanding that history didn't excuse anything Diane did to me or to our marriage, but it helped me understand why Addison found it so hard, for so long, to hold a firm line with her own mother. She'd spent 18 years learning that firm lines got punished. The engagement, when it came a year and a half later, brought its own preview of what was coming. Addison and I had picked a small guest list on purpose. 40 people, a backyard string of lights, nothing that required a second mortgage. Diane had other plans. She showed up to our first planning dinner with a binder, an actual 3-ring binder, tabbed by by vendor category, and informed us she'd already placed a deposit on a venue we'd never seen, a banquet hall in New Albany that seated 200. When Addison told her, as gently as she knew how, that it wasn't the wedding we wanted, Diane set her fork down and said she supposed the family diamond, her own mother's ring, the one she'd always promised would be reset for Addison's wedding day, would have to go to Nora instead, since apparently my opinion doesn't matter here. Addison cried in the car afterward, not because she wanted the ring particularly, but because the shape of the threat was so familiar to her already, the withholding of something valuable dressed up as a natural consequence of disrespect. We kept our small wedding. The ring never came up again until Nora's own engagement 3 years later, when Diane, true to her word, gave it to her instead, and told anyone who asked that Addison never really wanted it anyway. Addison and I got married 2 years later, in October, at a vineyard outside Granville. Diane cried during the ceremony, which I took at the time as a good sign. It wasn't until the reception that I understood the tears weren't about happiness. She cornered me near the bar and told me with a wine-loosened smile that she hoped I understood what a catch her daughter was, and that she expected me to keep up. I laughed it off. Addison laughed it off when I told her later that night. We were newlyweds. We had the luxury of laughing things off. 3 years ago, in September, I opened Birchwood Coffee Co. on the corner of High Street and 5th, right in the short north, in a storefront that had been a failed record shop for 2 years before I got the lease. I'd spent 11 months hunting for the right space before that one, walking away from 3 different leases when the numbers didn't work, until a landlord named Feldman finally agreed to a rent I could actually survive, $2,800 a month with a modest annual increase built in exchange for a 5-year commitment. I put every dollar I had into it. $61,000 of savings, a small business loan for another 40, and 80-hour weeks that Addison somehow tolerated without ever once making me feel guilty for missing dinners. Opening week, we sold out of pastries by 10 in the morning 3 days running, and I remember standing in the walk-in at midnight restocking for the next day, so tired I could barely see straight, thinking I had never been happier in my life. Addison believed in the shop before it made a single dollar of profit. She believed in it when the walk-in cooler died in our second month and I didn't know how we'd cover the repair. That's actually when the money came from Diane and Gerald. I want to be honest about that now, because at the time I only understood half of it, and the half I didn't understand is the half that matters most to this story. Addison told me her parents had offered us a loan, $42,000, to cover the cooler and a badly needed renovation of the kitchen line. I was proud, and prouder still that I hadn't had to ask. I signed what Addison told me was a simple promissory note. I didn't read every page. I trusted my wife. That trust would come back around to bite me in ways I couldn't have predicted that morning in the shop's back office, elbow deep in invoices 3 years later. Here's the earlier incident that, looking back now, was foreshadowing I completely missed. About 8 months after we opened, Diane started showing up on Saturday mornings, our busiest window, without ever ordering anything at first. She'd walk straight past the line, straight up to the counter, and announce to whichever employee was working the register that day, "I basically own this place. My son-in-law works for me." Then she'd order a latte and a croissant and walk off with them. No payment, no tip jar drop, nothing. The first time it happened, I laughed it off as Diane being Diane. The third time, I pulled her aside and asked her gently to please wait in line like everyone else. She looked at me like I'd slapped her. "I helped save this business," she said. "The least you could do is let your own family have a coffee." I didn't push it that day. I told myself it was a small thing, a few free drinks a week, not worth the family war it would take to stop it. That's the mistake so many of us make with people like Diane. We think the cost of boundaries is bigger than the cost of no boundaries. It never is. It just takes longer to see the bill. I did try to address it with Addison. She talked to her mother. Diane's response was to disappear for 2 full weeks, refusing calls, telling Gerald to tell anyone who asked that she was processing the disrespect. When she resurfaced, she acted as though nothing had happened, showed up on a Saturday morning, and ordered her free latte like clockwork. Addison, exhausted and not wanting another 2-week silence, let it go. I let it go too. I told myself it was easier. It was not easier. It was just later. The escalation, once it really started, didn't feel like escalation at the time. That's the thing nobody tells you about people like Diane. Every step looks small enough to survive on its own. It's only once you're standing in the wreckage that you can see the shape of the staircase you walk down. The first real step came about a year into the business, when I made the decision every small owner eventually has to make. I set a policy. No family exceptions, no free drinks, full stop, applying to everyone including my own wife when she came in on her lunch break. I told my staff this in a meeting, and I told Diane directly, over the phone, as clearly as I knew how. "From now on, you're a customer like anyone else when you're in the shop," I said. "I love you being there. I just need you to pay like everybody else." She was quiet for a second, long enough that I thought maybe, finally, it had landed. "So that's how it is," she said, "after everything we did for you." "This isn't about that," I said. "This is about fairness to my staff." "Your staff," she repeated, like the words tasted bad. "Fine. I understand exactly what I am to you now." She hung up. For 6 weeks, she was a perfect customer, paying full price, tipping generously even, and I actually let myself believe the boundary had worked. I told Addison it seemed like her mom had turned a corner. Addison didn't say much. Looking back, I think she already knew better than I did. The corner turned out to be a straight line back to where we'd started, just with a new route. On a Thursday morning in late late October. Diane came in with her entire book club, 6 women I recognized from Christmas parties and one I'd never met. And instead of ordering as a group the way any normal party of 7 would, she had each woman place a separate order, one at a time, each transaction paying full price and closing out cleanly until it was her turn. Then she ordered 2 lattes, a dozen macarons, and a loaf of the sourdough we only baked twice a week, and told the register, a college kid named Priya, not the lawyer, a different Priya, that she'd be paying the family rate. When Priya, confused, said she didn't know what that meant, Diane sighed loudly enough for the whole line to hear and said, "Just ring it up as employee comp, sweetheart. My son-in-law will sort it out later," and walked off with the bag before anyone could stop her. I found out about it that afternoon from a mortified Priya who thought she'd made a mistake. I hadn't blamed her. I'd called Diane that night and asked her directly why she'd tested my staff that way in front of an audience after we'd already had the conversation about full price. "I didn't test anyone," she said. "I don't even know what you're talking about. I paid for my own coffee like I always do." That was the first time I heard her deny something I had a witness and a register log for, flatly, without a flicker of hesitation, as though the version of events in her head simply overwrote the one that had actually happened. It wouldn't be the last. The second step came when Diane started inserting herself into staffing decisions. I'd hired a barista named Colton that spring, a college kid with 3 visible tattoos and an easy way with customers that made him one of our most requested employees. Diane took one look at him during a Saturday visit and told me, unprompted, that he gave off the wrong energy for the neighborhood, and that I should let him go before he attracted the wrong element. I told her, as evenly as I could manage, that Colton was one of my best employees and that his employment wasn't up for discussion. She brought it up 4 more times over the following month, each time in a different disguise. Once as concern for the shop's image, once as a story about a friend's business that had supposedly been ruined by a bad hire, a story that fell apart the moment I asked which friend, which business, and got a vague answer about someone from church, once memorably as tears, sitting at a corner table telling me she just worried about us so much and didn't understand why I wouldn't let her help. I told her again, gently but firmly, that I appreciated her concern and that the staffing decisions were mine to make. The last time she raised it, she came in on a Friday evening near close, waited until Colton was wiping down the espresso machine within easy earshot, and said, at a volume clearly calibrated to be overheard, "I just think it's a shame you'd rather keep someone like that than listen to your own family." Colton didn't say anything. He kept wiping the machine, jaw tight, and I saw him blink hard twice before he got it under control. I walked Diane out to the sidewalk that night and told her, as directly as I'd ever spoken to her, that if she ever said something like that in front of my staff again, she wouldn't be welcome in the shop at all. She looked genuinely stunned, the way people do when a door they've walked through 100 times suddenly doesn't open. "I was trying to protect this family," she said. "You embarrassed a 20-year-old kid doing his job," I said. "That's not protection. That's cruelty with better posture." She didn't speak to me for 9 days after that. Addison got the silence instead. Nightly calls about how unappreciated Diane felt, how nobody in the family understood the sacrifices she'd made, how she wondered sometimes why she bothered trying at all. Addison absorbed all of it, the way she always did, and told me about maybe a third of it, the way she always did too. She played the victim beautifully every single time. That was the pattern, if you looked closely enough. Diane never simply demanded something and accepted no for an answer. She demanded, got refused, reframed the refusal as an attack on her, and then made herself the injured party in a conflict she had started. The third step is the one I think about most now, because it's the one that planted the detail I didn't understand the significance of until much later. It was a Tuesday afternoon, slow at the shop, and I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. A man introduced himself as Harold Voss, said he was calling on behalf of a client, and asked politely but firmly whether I could send over the shop's quarterly financial statements. I told him I had no idea who he was or who his client was supposed to be, and that I wasn't in the habit of handing my books to strangers over the phone. He apologized, said he understood, and told me he'd follow up in writing instead. No letter ever came, at least not one I saw, though I'd later learn Addison had intercepted at least one from the mailbox before I got to it. I assumed the calls were some kind of business loan phishing attempt and told him as much the second time he called, a month later, using the exact same script, the exact same phrase, as outlined in the agreement, a sentence that meant nothing to me at the time and everything to me later. He called a third time in the spring, patient as ever, and I finally just stopped answering numbers I didn't recognize on shop hours altogether. I mentioned it to Addison once, in passing, as a strange, recurring nuisance call, the kind of thing you complain about for 30 seconds and then forget. She went quiet for a beat longer than the moment called for and said she'd look into it. She never brought it up again, and I let it drop, the way you let drop 100 small oddities in a busy life, never imagining any of them are load-bearing. The fourth step involved Gerald's health, and it's the one that still makes my jaw tighten when I think about it. Gerald had a minor cardiac scare that winter, a stress test that came back concerning enough for a stent. Nothing life-threatening, but frightening for the family, regardless. I drove to Riverside Methodist the night he was admitted and sat in the waiting room with Addison for 4 hours, sent flowers the next morning, visited twice that week. I meant every bit of the concern I showed. Diane, though, found a way to fold Gerald's health into the ongoing argument about the shop within days of of him coming home. She told Addison, in a call I only heard secondhand, that Gerald's blood pressure was through the roof because of how disrespected we've been at that coffee shop, as though a 63-year-old man's cardiac event could be traced back, with any medical honesty, to his son-in-law enforcing a no-free drinks policy at a coffee counter. She called me directly a few days later, her voice softer than usual, almost pleading. "Your father-in-law could have died," she said. "Doesn't that mean anything to you? Doesn't family mean anything?" I told her I was glad Gerald was recovering and that I loved him, and that his health had nothing to do with a business policy I'd already explained to her a dozen times. She hung up without another word. Addison cried after that call, once she heard the full version from her mother's side, the guilt landing exactly where it was aimed even though neither of us believed it belonged there. I held her and said nothing else useful because there wasn't anything else to say. You cannot argue someone out of a guilt trip built on someone else's chest pain. You can only wait for them to run out of breath. The fifth step arrived that spring, and this was the one that finally showed me the full shape of what I was dealing with. Diane began showing up unannounced at our daughter's daycare. Vivian was 3 at the time, our only child, the kind of kid who narrated her own life out loud in a running commentary that made strangers in grocery stores smile. Diane loved her genuinely, in the specific and complicated way Diane loved anything that reflected well on her. She started picking Vivi up from daycare on days she hadn't been asked to, days we hadn't arranged, telling the front desk she was just helping out, while Addison and I were both, in fact, perfectly available, and simply hadn't been told a change was happening. The worst of it came on a Tuesday in April. Addison arrived at pickup at 5:15, the way she did every day, and Vivi wasn't there. The director told her, apologetically, that Grandma had signed her out at 3, listed as an authorized contact on old intake paperwork none of us had thought to update. Addison called Diane's phone 4 times with no answer. She called Gerald. She called me at the shop, her voice cracking in a way I'd only heard once before, at her own father's hospital bedside. I left mid-shift and drove straight to her parents' house, already composing the words I'd need to say to a 911 dispatcher in my head. Diane finally answered on my 3rd call, from a nail salon in Grandview, completely unbothered, Vivi coloring quietly in the chair beside her. "I just missed her," she said when I asked too sharply why she hadn't called anyone in 2 hours. "Is it a crime to spend time with my own granddaughter now?" It wasn't a crime. It was also not something either of us had agreed to, and the 2 hours of not knowing where our 3-year-old was had taken something out of both of us that didn't fully come back for weeks. When we sat her down and explained, as calmly as either of us could manage after that afternoon, that pickups needed to be arranged in advance and confirmed in writing going forward, she cried and said we were punishing her for loving her grandchild too much. 2 weeks later, a daycare teacher mentioned, in passing, that Vivi had said something odd during nap time, that Grandma had told her more than once that Mommy and Daddy don't want Grandma around anymore. A sentence no 3-year-old should have to carry, delivered by the one adult in her life who should have understood that better than anyone. That was the moment I understood we weren't dealing with someone difficult. We were dealing with someone who would use a child as leverage without blinking, and who would do it quietly enough that we'd have no proof beyond a 4-year-old's confused report at nap time, until months later, the daycare's own camera system handed us proof we never expected to need. There was a 6th step, smaller than the rest, but strange enough that it stuck with me at the time even though I couldn't explain why. Addison had given her mother a spare key years earlier, back before any of this started, for the rare occasion Diane might need to drop something off when the shop was closed. One Monday morning, I came in before sunrise to find the menu board completely rewritten in handwriting that wasn't mine or any of my staff's, our seasonal pumpkin latte replaced with something called a Diane's Autumn Delight, priced $2 higher than anything else on the board. I assumed at first that Lily had done it as a joke and asked her about it, confused when she came in for her shift. She had no idea what I was talking about. It took me 3 days to work out that Diane had let herself in with the old key, sometime after close, and rearranged the board to reflect what she apparently believed her consultation rights entitled her to. I had the locks changed that week and told Addison to get the spare key back. Addison asked for it. Diane said she'd lost it. She hadn't. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show, linked in the description, for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. We tightened everything after the daycare incident. Pickups required both our signatures, confirmed in advance, no exceptions. Diane's response was 6 weeks of silence, followed by a sudden reappearance at a family barbecue where she acted so warm and so normal that Addison's siblings, Trevor and Nora, both remarked on how good it was to see her back to herself. I said nothing. I'd stopped believing in Diane's good moods as anything but weather that would change again, which brings me back to that Saturday morning, the one that started this story. The morning the line wrapped around the block because we'd been featured in a local food blog the week before. The morning Lily was drowning behind the register with 3 orders backed up, and a mother-in-law who decided that was the perfect moment to demand 6 drinks and a dozen pastries, immediately, for free, and to loudly announce her ownership of a business she did not, in any legal sense, own. What I didn't know, standing in that wreckage, broom in hand, was that Harold Voss's calls and the agreement he kept referencing were about to become the center of everything. The officers arrived about 5 minutes after my call, 2 of them, an older one named Bellamy with a gray mustache and the unhurried manner of a man who'd seen every version of this scene before. 4, and a younger one named Reyes, notepad already out. Diane ran to them the second they stepped through the door, sobbing, pointing at me, her whole body trembling in a way it had not been trembling 30 seconds earlier. "He attacked me," she said. "I'm terrified of him. Please, someone has to help me." I didn't argue with her. I've learned with Diane that arguing in the moment only feeds her. I asked Officer Bellamy to step into my back office, and I pulled up the security footage on the monitor there. 4 camera angles, crystal clear, time-stamped. Diane screaming at Lily. Me walking up, hands open, voice level, asking her to leave. Diane's arm sweeping deliberately across the display counter. A full, unmistakable motion, sending 6 mugs crashing to the floor in one clean sweep. Diane, not 2 full seconds later, laughing, before catching herself and remembering to look afraid. Bellamy watched it twice. He didn't say much. He asked me one question, whether the footage was time-stamped and unedited, and I told him it pulled directly from the cloud server with no way for me to alter it even if I'd wanted to. He nodded once, thanked me, and walked back out to the front of the shop, where Diane was sipping a cup of water a sympathetic stranger had brought her, still playing the role of a fragile, terrified woman for an audience of 50 people who had, every one of them, just watched her do the opposite of fragile. He pulled the handcuffs off his belt. "Diane Whitfield, you're under arrest for criminal mischief and disorderly conduct." Her whole face broke apart. She started thrashing, screaming my name, screaming that we were family, that I needed to fix this immediately, that I owed her that much after everything, that she couldn't believe her own son-in-law would do this to her. I stood there with the broom sweeping shards of a $2,000 display into a dustpan, hands steadier than I expected them to be, and I told Officer Reyes that I wanted to press full charges, and a trespass order, effective immediately, barring her from the property. They walked her out in handcuffs, past the line of customers who'd been watching the entire thing unfold, like a scene from a show they didn't know they'd signed up for. A few of them clapped. One older man told me quietly, on his way out, that his own mother-in-law had done something similar to his family's restaurant 20 years ago, and that he wished someone had had a camera then. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt like I'd finally set down something I'd been carrying so long, my shoulders had forgotten what it felt like without the weight. The station called Addison directly that afternoon, since she was listed as Diane's next of kin, and by the time I got home that night, she was sitting at our kitchen table with her phone face down in front of her, refusing to look at it, a mug of tea gone cold beside her. "She's going to make this so much worse," Addison said quietly. "You know that, right?" I did know that. I just didn't know how much worse, or in what shape. Diane sat in a holding cell for 14 hours before Gerald finally came and posted her bond. Addison didn't go. I didn't ask her to. That night, close to midnight, my phone buzzed on the nightstand with a text from a number I didn't recognize. 4 words, nothing else. "You will regret this." I showed it to Addison. She stared at the screen a long moment, her face going pale in the blue light. "That's not my mother's number," she said. "I don't know whose it is." I told myself it was probably nothing. A friend of Diane's blowing off steam on her behalf, the kind of empty threat angry people send when they have no other outlet. I wanted to believe that. I went to sleep telling myself the worst of it was over, that the arrest had been the ceiling, that whatever came next would be smaller. I was wrong about that too. 3 days later, I unlocked the shop before sunrise, same as every morning, coffee in hand, half asleep, running through the day's prep list in my head. I stopped dead on the sidewalk before I even got the key fully into the lock. Someone had spray painted across our front window in dripping red letters, 6 feet wide. "This is mine too." Taped beneath it, protected in a plastic sleeve so the morning dew wouldn't smear it, was a printed document. Several pages, stapled, with a section highlighted in yellow, and a signature circled in the same red marker used on the glass. I recognized the signature before I even fully processed what I was looking at. Diane Whitfield's handwriting, looping and deliberate, exactly like the way she signed birthday cards. My stomach dropped somewhere around my knees. I stood on that sidewalk for a full minute before I made myself walk closer and actually read what I was looking at. It was a contract. Dated 3 years earlier, the same month we'd fixed the walk-in cooler. Titled, in language dense enough that I had to read it twice, Investment and Consultation Agreement. My name was on it, Addison's name was on it, and Diane's name was on it, not as a lender, not as a family member extending a helping hand, but as a minority equity holder, 12% of Birchwood Coffee Co., with a clause, the highlighted section, granting her reasonable consultation rights on customer-facing business decisions and quarterly access to financial statements upon request. I understood, standing on that sidewalk with red paint drying above my head, exactly who Harold Voss was and exactly why he'd been calling for 3 years about paperwork I'd never known existed. The $42,000 I'd thought was a loan from in-laws who wanted to help us had never been a loan at all. It was an investment. Diane owned part of my business, and she had, on paper at least, owned it the entire time she'd been walking to the front of the line, telling my staff she basically owned this place. She hadn't been delusional. She'd been telling the truth in the specific, weaponized way Diane told any truth, and I hadn't known it. I called Addison before I even called anyone to clean the window. My hands were shaking hard enough that I had to try the number twice. "I need you to come to the shop right now," I said, "and I need you to explain something to me." She was there in 11 minutes. I watched her face when she saw the window, watched the color drain out of it, watched her read the highlighted contract page in the plastic sleeve with an expression I'd never seen on her before. Not surprise. Guilt. "You knew," I said. It wasn't a question. Mark, she stopped, started again. When the cooler died, we needed $42,000 in 4 days, or we were going to lose the whole shop before it even had a real chance. My parents offered. My mom insisted on drawing up something formal. I thought it was just protecting the loan. I didn't understand what the consultation clause actually meant until Harold started calling and I realized she thought it gave her, I don't know, a say in everything. I told myself it didn't matter because she'd never actually use it. I was wrong. I should have told you. I'm so sorry I didn't tell you. I want to be honest about that moment because this isn't a story where my wife is a villain. She wasn't. She was 29, terrified of losing the business her husband had put everything into, faced with a mother who made every act of help feel like it came with strings attached, and she made a decision under pressure that she spent 3 years quietly regretting and hoping would never matter. I understood that even as I stood there furious. I was furious at Diane. I was hurt by Addison in a smaller, more survivable way. Those were two different feelings, and it took me longer than I'd like to admit to separate them clearly enough to speak, without it coming out as one undifferentiated wave of anger at both of them. Why didn't you tell me the moment Harold started calling? I asked her, once we were both sitting at the shop's back office table, the plastic-sleeved contract between us like something radioactive, because by then it felt too late, she said. I'd already let 3 months go by without saying anything, and every month after that made it feel like a bigger confession than the last one. I kept thinking I'd find a way to just quietly buy her out myself before you ever had to know it existed. I was wrong about how much time I had. I'm sorry, Mark. I should have handed you this contract the day I signed it. You should have, I agreed. But I understand why you didn't. That doesn't mean it didn't cost us something. I need you to know both of those things are true at once. Because I don't think I can pretend it's fine right now. And I also don't think you're the one who did this to us on purpose. She nodded, eyes wet, and reached across the table for my hand. I let her take it, but it took me a few days before the gesture felt entirely natural again. We're going to deal with this, I said finally, but I need to see everything, every page, tonight. We sat at our kitchen table until almost 1 in the morning going through the full contract, line by line, with a legal pad between us. The picture that emerged was worse than either of us had understood on our own. Diane's 12% stake wasn't just symbolic. It came with real teeth. Consultation rights on hiring, on staffing changes, on menu decisions, on any matter materially affecting the customer experience of the business. It was vague enough to justify almost anything Diane wanted to insert herself into, and specific enough that a lawyer could argue we'd been in breach for years by ignoring Harold's quarterly requests and making staffing decisions, like keeping Colton, like setting the no free drinks policy, without her sign-off. The red paint on the window wasn't random vandalism. It was Diane's opening argument. I called an attorney the next morning, a business litigator named Priya Anand, who specialized in exactly this kind of family-adjacent equity dispute, more common, she told me, than people would guess. Her office was above a dry cleaner on Grandview Avenue, and she read through the contract in our first meeting with a yellow highlighter, marking sections as she went, occasionally muttering things like, "That's aggressive," under her breath in a way that made my stomach tighten each time. She told me plainly, once she'd finished, that Diane's stake was legally real, 12%, properly notarized, and that the consultation clause, while poorly drafted, gave Diane enough standing to make our lives difficult if we tried to simply ignore her going forward. A courtroom fight to invalidate the agreement, she said, was possible but expensive, likely 18 months at minimum, with legal fees that could easily eclipse the value of the stake itself before a judge ever ruled. Our best path, she said, wasn't proving Diane wrong. It was buying her out entirely, cleanly, with paperwork airtight enough that nothing like this could ever surface again. Get her out. Pay fair value. Sever the tie for good, on paper, permanently. People think the goal in situations like this is winning, Priya told me, closing the folder. The goal is usually just an ending. A clean one, if you can afford it. I asked Addison if she thought her mother would ever agree to that. She looked at me for a long moment before she answered. I think we need to make her family watch what she actually is first, she said, or she'll never agree to anything. She'll just feel cornered and get worse. We spent the better part of a week putting that plan together, sitting at our kitchen table most nights after Vivi went down, pulling clips off the shop's cloud server and the daycare's archived footage, cross-referencing dates against the calendar of everything that had happened over the past 18 months. It felt strange, methodical in a way that had nothing to do with the anger either of us still carried, more like assembling a case file than confronting a mother. Addison insisted on watching every clip herself before we used any of it, including the daycare footage of Diane telling Vivi that her parents didn't want grandma around, and I watched her face go rigid the first time she saw it, her own mother's voice coming out of a 3-year-old's naptime camera. I need everyone to see this, she said quietly, closing the laptop. Not just hear about it secondhand, everyone. That's how we ended up at her parents' house on a Sunday afternoon in late October. The whole family gathered under the pretense of a normal visit, Gerald grilling in the backyard, Trevor and Nora both there, Vivi playing on the patio with a set of chalk. I'd brought a laptop. I hadn't told anyone why. We waited until after lunch, once everyone was settled in the living room, coffee in hand, the kind of lazy Sunday quiet that made what came next feel almost cruel in its contrast. Diane was in good spirits. She'd been out on bond for 2 weeks, awaiting her court date on the criminal mischief charge, and she'd apparently decided the best strategy strategy was to act as though none of it had happened. I think it's time we talked about the shop, I said. All of us. Diane's smile didn't waver. There's nothing to talk about. I'm entitled to what I'm entitled to. You are, I said. Legally. I've seen the contract now. All of it. Including the parts you never mentioned to me for 3 years. Gerald set his coffee cup down slowly. What contract? I opened the laptop. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I played 4 months of security footage, compiled and timestamped. The same footage I'd shown Officer Bellamy, along with 3 additional clips nobody in that room had seen. Diane rearranging our menu board without permission on a night the shop was closed, letting herself in with a spare key Addison hadn't known she still had. Diane telling 3-year-old Vivi, captured on the daycare's own security camera when we requested the footage after the pickup incident, that her parents didn't want grandma around. Diane on the morning of the arrest, laughing, seconds after sweeping $2,000 of ceramic onto the floor of a business she claimed to be protecting. The room went silent in a way I'd never heard the Whitfield living room go silent before. This is insulting, Diane said, but her voice had lost its certainty. You're editing things, taking things out of context. There's no context that makes any of this okay, Mom, Nora said quietly. I looked over and saw her hand pressed against her mouth, the same posture Lily had had standing at the pastry case 3 weeks earlier. I gave you money, Diane said, turning on me now, her voice climbing. I gave you a business. Without me, you'd still be some barista working for someone else. You'd be nothing. You gave us a loan you turned into a leash, I said, and you used my daughter as a hostage to make sure I didn't pull too hard on it. That's what I need you to hear today, in front of everyone. Not that you helped us once, that you've spent 3 years making sure we never forgot it, and using every soft spot we have to keep control. I'm not doing that anymore. Neither is Addison. Trevor spoke up before Diane could answer, his voice tighter than I'd ever heard it. You know what, Mom? I'm not even surprised anymore. You did the exact same thing with the down payment on our house. $14,000, and for 2 years you called Jess every time we made a decision on the renovation you didn't like, reminding her whose money had made the house possible in the first place. I never told anyone how bad it got, because I figured that was just how parents who helped you out acted. Watching this, I don't think that anymore. That was completely different, Diane snapped. That was a gift. You called it a gift for 2 years and a leash the one time we didn't ask your opinion on cabinet hardware, Trevor said. I know the difference now. I didn't back then. You'll regret this, Diane said, and I recognized the words instantly, the same 4 words that had lit up my phone the night of the arrest. That was you, I said. The text. She didn't deny it. She didn't have to. Her silence was the confession, sitting there in front of her husband and both her other children. Gerald spoke for the first time in several minutes, and his voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. Diane, did you send that boy a threatening text message the night I bailed you out of jail? He deserved it, she said. You should have seen how he humiliated me in front of my friends. You destroyed his shop, Trevor said, in front of 50 people. There's footage of you laughing about it. Addison, who had been quiet through most of it, finally spoke, and her voice was steadier than I'd heard it in weeks. Mom, I've spent my whole life making myself smaller so you wouldn't feel threatened. I hid a contract from my own husband because I was more afraid of your reaction than his. I'm done doing that. You're going to sell back your stake in Mark's business at a fair price, and you're going to stop showing up at Vivi's daycare, and you're going to stop telling my daughter things that aren't true. If you can't do those 3 things, you don't get access to any of us. I mean that. I watched something in Gerald's face fold in on itself. 36 years of quiet accommodation finally reaching a floor it couldn't sink through anymore. I want to see the paperwork, he said to me. All of it. Tonight. The aftermath spread out slower than the confrontation had. The way water finds every low point in a room, instead of settling all at once. Gerald went through the entire contract with Priya over the following 2 weeks, and what he found embarrassed him in a way I hadn't expected. He hadn't known about the consultation clause's real teeth. He'd signed off on the investment believing it was a way to help his daughter's family with strings no tighter than call and check in sometimes. He apologized to me directly. The first time in 6 years of marriage he'd said more than a handful of words to me at once, and told me he'd support a buyout at fair value, funded, if it came to it, from his own retirement accounts rather than fight us over it. Diane did not go quietly. She called Trevor and told him I'd brainwashed his sister against her, and when that didn't land, she tried a different approach, calling Jess directly to relitigate the cabinet hardware fight from 4 years earlier as though it had just happened, apparently hoping to reopen an old wound before Trevor could close a new one. It backfired. Trevor called me that same night, something almost like relief in his voice, and told me he'd spent a decade assuming his mother's behavior toward him was ordinary, the standard cost of accepting help from family, and that watching mine play out in real time, on camera, with a police report attached, had finally given him language for what he'd lived through too. She called Nora crying every night for a week after that, until Nora, exhausted and torn between 2 people she loved, finally told her mother she needed space. It produced another 2-week disappearance, this one landing very differently than the first had, because nobody chased after her this time. The criminal case went before a magistrate in December, a gray Tuesday morning in a courtroom that smelled like old carpet and copier toner. Diane's attorney, a heavyset man named Dwight Aldrich, who specialized, according to his firm's website, in family and small business dispute resolution, argued for a diversion program given her lack of prior record. The prosecutor, a young assistant district attorney who'd clearly watched the security footage more than once, pushed back hard enough that Diane ended up pleading to the lesser charges rather than risk a trial where 50 witnesses and 4 camera angles would be available to the state. She sat through the entire hearing in a cardigan I recognized from a Christmas years earlier, hands folded, saying nothing beyond what her attorney instructed. I watched Gerald watch her from 2 rows back, his face unreadable, and I understood even then that whatever was left of their marriage was sitting in that courtroom with them. She showed up at the shop once more, in November, on a day the trespass order technically barred her from being anywhere near the property. It was a Wednesday, mid-morning, quiet enough that I noticed her through the front window before she'd even reached the door, standing on the sidewalk in a coat I didn't recognize, staring at the new display case like she was trying to memorize it. A regular customer recognized her from the viral video. Someone had posted the arrest footage online within a day of it happening, and it had picked up a strange kind of local infamy. 40,000 views, comment sections full of strangers arguing about mothers-in-law they'd known, and called the police before I even made it to the door myself. She was gone before officers arrived, but a neighboring shop's outdoor camera had caught her standing there for nearly 6 minutes, doing nothing, saying nothing to anyone, just watching. I never fully understood what she was doing that morning. Part of me still wonders if even she didn't know. There were smaller cruelties along the way too. An anonymous 1-star review appeared on our shop's page within days of the family confrontation, written in language specific enough, right down to a reference to the way he talks down to his own family, that I recognized Diane's phrasing, even without a name attached. A woman claiming to be a former employee called Lily's nursing school with a complaint that turned out to be entirely fabricated, alleging Lily had stolen from a previous employer, a claim the program's director dismissed within a day once Lily produced 2 years of spotless work records, though the week of waiting to hear back had cost Lily several sleepless nights she didn't deserve. Lily came to me white-faced on a Thursday morning, phone shaking in her hand, convinced her entire nursing career was about to end over a lie, and I sat with her in the back office for 20 minutes before opening, telling her exactly what had happened with the shop's own contract, and assuring her we'd back her with a written statement if her program needed one. I wrote that letter that same afternoon. Her director never ended up asking for it, but I think just having it ready helped Lily breathe a little easier that week. None of it was proven in a way that would hold up in court, but all of it had Diane's signature on it as clearly as the contract had. Our first Thanksgiving without her at the table was quieter than any Thanksgiving I could remember. Gerald came alone, brought a pecan pie he'd clearly bought rather than baked, and stayed longer than he needed to, helping Vivi build a fort out of couch cushions in the living room while the turkey rested. Nobody mentioned Diane's name until Vivi did, unprompted, asking if Grandma was coming next year. Addison knelt down to her level and said simply that Grandma needed some time to work on some things, and that we loved her even so. Gerald excused himself to the kitchen for a minute after that. I found him standing at the sink, not doing anything, just standing there, and I put a hand on his shoulder and didn't say a word because there wasn't one that would have helped. I grieved, somewhere in the middle of all that legal texture, in a way I hadn't expected to. Not for the woman who'd smashed my display or sent a threatening text or lied to 2 police officers with her hand pressed to her chest. I grieved for an earlier version of her I found. One afternoon going through old phone photos, looking for something else entirely, a receipt I needed for an insurance claim. A picture from Vivi's 2nd birthday surfaced instead. Diane on her knees on our kitchen floor, flour dusted on both their hands, teaching Vivi how to fold batter into a cake pan without deflating it, both of them laughing at something the photo couldn't capture. I sat on the edge of our bed for a long time with that photo open on my phone, Addison asleep beside me, and felt something I hadn't expected to feel after everything. Not anger, just a long, quiet ache for a version of Diane that had existed, that I'd seen in flashes often enough over 6 years to keep hoping she was the real one, and the rest was an aberration. Sitting with that photo, I understood finally that she wasn't an aberration. She was one genuine setting among several, and I no longer got to choose which one showed up on any given morning. Nobody in our family did, and none of us ever really had. That's its own kind of loss. Mourning a person who is still alive, still capable, in theory, of being different, and choosing again and again not to be. Nobody sends flowers for that kind of grief. There isn't a card for it at the drugstore. You just carry it quietly and keep going. The buyout closed in January. $55,000, roughly $13,000 above what a strict valuation of her 12% would have justified, a premium Priya recommended we pay anyway just to close the door faster and cleaner, without leaving Diane a legitimate grievance about being lowballed that she could nurse for another decade. It was funded jointly by Gerald's retirement savings and a small business loan I took out in my own name this time. No family cosigners, no consultation clauses, nothing but my signature and the bank's. Diane's 12% became 0 in writing, notarized. With a non-disparagement clause, Priya insisted on that Diane's attorney fought for exactly 4 days before accepting. Harold Voss sent one final email confirming the transfer, polite and impersonal, the professional bookend to 3 years of quarterly phone calls I'd once dismissed as scam attempts, and I remember reading it twice just to be sure it actually said what I thought it said. The criminal case resolved a few weeks later with a plea to the lesser charges, restitution of $3,100 covering the display and the injured customer's medical bill, 40 hours of community service, and a 2-year no-contract no-contact order that made the earlier trespass order permanent and formal. Diane didn't look at me once during that final hearing. I'm not sure, honestly, whether that was shame or simply her deciding I no longer merited the eye contact. I've stopped trying to guess which version of her would have been true. Addison and I went to counseling for 4 months, working through what it meant that she'd carried a secret that large for 3 years out of fear of exactly the conflict it eventually caused anyway. Some sessions were harder than others. There was one, in February, where Addison finally said out loud that part of her had known, on some level, that keeping the contract quiet was its own kind of protecting her mother instead of protecting me, and that admitting that out loud felt worse than the secret itself had. I told her I understood, because I'd spent 6 years doing a smaller version of the same thing, absorbing Diane's behavior quietly so Addison wouldn't have to choose between us. We're in a better place now than we were before any of this happened, which is a strange thing to be able to say about a year that started with a mother-in-law smashing a display case in front of 50 strangers. But grief and growth have never respected each other's schedules. It's been almost a year since that Saturday morning now. The shop is doing better than it ever has. We rebuilt the display with a new set from the same potter in Athens, sturdier this time, mounted on a base instead of a freestanding table. A small practical lesson learned the expensive way. Lily is a shift lead now, halfway through her nursing prerequisites, training 2 newer hires with a patience I don't think she'd have had a year ago. She still gets a little tense on Saturday mornings when the line gets long, a flinch I notice even when nobody else would, though it happens less with each month that passes. Gerald comes by most Sundays now, alone, orders a plain coffee, sits at the corner table by the window for 20 minutes or so, and leaves a $5 tip on a $4 drink like he's trying to correct a debt that was never really his to pay. He and Diane separated in February, finalized by summer. He didn't ask her to leave over the shop exactly, he told me once. Half a coffee in, staring out at High Street like the answer was written on the sidewalk. It was more that once he'd finally seen clearly, after 36 years of choosing not to, he found he couldn't go back to not seeing. Nora comes in sometimes too, usually with a friend, usually orders too many pastries and laughs about it, slowly becoming the kind of easy presence in the shop her mother never managed to be. Trevor drives up from Cincinnati every few months, always brings his kids, always insists on paying full price, even when I try to wave him off. Vivi still asks about Grandma Diane sometimes, usually apropos of nothing, the way 4-year-olds surface things adults have carefully packed away, usually right at bedtime when the day's defenses are down for both of us. We've told her the truth in pieces small enough for her to hold. Grandma made some choices that hurt people. Grandma isn't able to be around right now. We love her, and we're also keeping her safe, and keeping Grandma's feelings from being in charge of our house. It isn't a clean answer. I don't think there's a clean answer for a kid whose grandmother taught her to fold cake batter on a kitchen floor, and also told her, on camera, that her parents didn't want that grandmother around anymore. Both of those things are true at once. Vivi will get to hold the complicated version of that when she's older, if she wants to, and decide for herself what to do with it. That's not a door I'm going to lock for her, even though it's one I've had to close for myself, at least for now. I think about that line Diane screamed at me the morning she wrecked the shop more than I'd like to, that I'd be nothing without her daughter. I understand now that she meant it as a threat, a reminder of the debt she believed I owed her forever, the kind of debt that never gets marked paid no matter how much interest you cover. It landed somewhere else entirely months later, once the dust settled and the paperwork cleared and the window stopped needing to be checked for red paint every morning before I unlocked the door. She was right, in a way she never intended and would probably resent if I said it to her face. I am better, fuller, more myself because of Addison, because of the family we've built around our daughter and this shop and the strangers who show up here every morning wanting nothing more complicated than a good cup of coffee and somewhere warm to sit for a while. I didn't need Diane for any of that. I needed boundaries, and I needed about 3 years longer than I should have to find the nerve to hold them without apologizing for it. The shop still smells like cinnamon and burnt sugar most mornings when I unlock the door before sunrise. There's no red paint on the window anymore, though I still, without quite meaning to, glance at the glass first thing every morning before my key even reaches the lock. There's a small brass plaque by the register now, easy to miss unless you're looking for it, engraved with a line Addison had made for me the week the buyout closed. It just says, built by us, for us, no footnotes, no fine print, no quarterly calls from anyone I never agreed to answer to. I lost a version of family I'd hoped for, back at that first dinner table in Bexley, 6 years and a lifetime ago when I still believed Diane was simply particular and would soften once she trusted me. She never did soften, and I've stopped waiting for her to. What I found instead was the version that was actually real, the one that shows up, that tells the truth even when it costs something, that doesn't need a signed contract to prove where it stands. Most mornings, standing behind the counter as the first regulars come through the door, coffee steam fogging the glass I check every day out of habit, that feels like more than a fair trade for what I gave up. Some mornings it still just feels like grief with better lighting. I've learned to let both of those be true at the same time, and to keep opening the shop anyway, every single morning, whether or not the feeling has sorted itself out yet by the time I turn the key.